The headless body was found in a forest outside Kyiv on November 2, 2000. Georgy Gongadze, a pioneering anti-corruption journalist who had spent months investigating Ukraine's ruling elite, had been missing for weeks. 3 months before his disappearance, he told colleagues he was going into hiding because Ukraine's security services were harassing him. Audio recordings that later surfaced allegedly captured President Leonid Kuchma ordering subordinates to deal with the troublesome reporter. When Gongadze's decapitated corpse was finally discovered in a shallow grave, his skull was never found. The murder sent shockwaves through Ukraine and the international community, but for one man, the scandal presented an opportunity rather than a crisis. That man was Viktor Pinchuk, and he had married President Kuchma's daughter just 3 years earlier. Viktor Mikhailovich Pinchuk was born in 1960 in Kyiv to Jewish parents who later moved to the industrial city of Dnipropetrovsk. Unlike the violent gangsters who would dominate Russia's criminal underworld in the 1990s, Pinchuk came from intellectual stock. His mother taught at the Dnipropetrovsk Metallurgical Institute, the same institution that would award her son a PhD in 1987. He studied metallurgy and engineering, developing expertise in pipe manufacturing that would become the foundation of his future empire. But education alone doesn't create billionaires in the post-Soviet space. What separates the wealthy from the super-wealthy in countries like Ukraine is timing, ruthlessness, and connections to power. As the Soviet economy began opening under Gorbachev's perestroika policies in the late 1980s, Pinchuk saw his chance. He went to work for a pipe factory in Belarus, but his first venture flopped spectacularly. The institution failed to honor a royalty agreement for pipes he had designed, leaving him with nothing but experience and bitterness. He returned to Ukraine as the USSR was collapsing, and in 1990 he founded Interpipe Company based on his patented innovations. The timing was perfect. The Soviet industrial complex was disintegrating, central planning had collapsed, and a shadow economy of barter and informal trade was exploding across the former Soviet republics. When asked years later by Tablet magazine how he first became a millionaire, Pinchuk gave a cryptic answer that revealed everything and nothing. Juicers turned into pipes. It was a perfect encapsulation of the chaotic early 1990s in Ukraine, when fortunes were made by those clever and connected enough to exploit the gap between the dying Soviet system and the emerging market economy. Consumer goods like juicers could be bartered for industrial inputs. Those inputs could be transformed into high-value products like steel pipes. Those pipes could be sold for hard currency or traded for assets, and those assets, if acquired at the right moment from the right desperate factory director or corrupt official, could form the basis of an industrial empire. But Pinchuk wasn't just another entrepreneur working the angles in Ukraine's Wild East economy. He was building something bigger, and he understood that real wealth in Ukraine required political protection. In 1994, he made a move that would prove crucial to his future. He partnered with Yulia Tymoshenko, an enterprising businesswoman from Dnipro who would later become prime minister, to create Sodruzhestvo, an energy trading company importing Central Asian gas. It was a brilliant play. Energy trading was where the real money was in 1990s Ukraine, as gas and oil from Central Asia flowed through Ukrainian pipelines to European markets. Controlling even a small piece of that trade could generate millions. However, in 1995, Pinchuk withdrew from the joint venture with Tymoshenko under circumstances that remain murky to this day. Some suggest a falling out over money or control. Others hint at more serious disagreements about business methods or political alliances. Whatever the reason, the split foreshadowed their later political rivalry, with Tymoshenko becoming a champion of the Orange Revolution and Pinchuk backing the establishment forces she opposed. But by leaving the energy sector when he did, Pinchuk may have dodged legal troubles that would later engulf others in that industry. Instead, he focused on building Interpipe into a major producer of seamless pipes and railway wheels. The pipe business depended heavily on good relations with Russia, which remained the major export market even after Ukrainian independence. Pinchuk cultivated those relationships carefully, understanding that in the post-Soviet space, business and politics were inseparable. He was establishing himself as an important local figure in Dnipropetrovsk, but he was still just a regional player. To become a true oligarch, he needed something more. He needed access to the presidential administration. The year 1996 brought both danger and opportunity. Highlighting the extreme risks of doing business in Ukraine during this period, Pinchuk was reportedly kidnapped by criminals demanding a $2 million ransom. The incident was never fully explained to the public, and details remained scarce, but it underscored a brutal reality. Ukraine, in the mid-1990s, was a place where organized crime, corrupt officials, and emerging oligarchs battled for control of state assets and lucrative businesses. Contract killings were common. Kidnappings of businessmen and their family members happened regularly. Physical violence was a standard business negotiation tool. Pinchuk survived the ordeal, whether by paying the ransom, using connections to secure his release, or some combination of both. The experience didn't scare him away from business. Instead, it seemed to steel his determination to reach a level of wealth and power where such threats would be unthinkable. And in 1997, he made the move that would change everything. He left his wife Olena Arshava for another woman, also named Olena, who happened to be the daughter of Ukraine's president, Leonid Kuchma. The new Olena was already married at the time to the son of one of her father's political allies who headed the Crimean regional government, making the affair a sensitive political matter. But Pinchuk wasn't deterred by social conventions or political complications. He divorced his first wife and married Olena Kuchma, instantly becoming the president's son-in-law. The marriage transformed him from a successful regional businessman into a member of Ukraine's ruling family. Suddenly, doors that had been closed were flung open. State officials who might have ignored his calls now competed for his attention. Privatization deals that seemed impossibly complex became straightforward. Access to cheap credit from state-controlled banks materialized. The marriage to Olena Kuchma wasn't just a personal relationship. It was the single most valuable business decision Viktor Pinchuk ever made. President Leonid Kuchma had come to power in 1994, promising economic reforms and closer ties with the West. But his administration quickly became synonymous with corruption and the consolidation of oligarchic power. Kuchma openly embraced the creation of an oligarchic system, treating it as a conscious policy priority that he trumpeted early and often. The idea was that a small group of super-wealthy businessmen, loyal to the president and dependent on his favor, would control Ukraine's key industries and media. In exchange for this wealth and power, they would provide political support, funding, and favorable media coverage. This system required the transfer of state assets to private hands, and the 1998 parliamentary elections brought a new crop of business power brokers to Kyiv who would facilitate exactly that. Viktor Pinchuk was elected to parliament, beginning the first of two consecutive terms that would run from 1998 to 2006. The list of parliamentarians from that era reads like a who's who of Ukraine's future oligarchy and later criminal investigations. There was Igor Bakai, alleged mastermind behind schemes at Naftogaz Ukraine, an energy behemoth that became the center of gas trading scandals. There was Mykola Martynenko of Ukraine's nuclear energy sector, who would eventually be investigated by Swiss, Czech, and Ukrainian authorities for bribery, fraud, and money laundering. There was Konstantin Zhivago, who would make Forbes' Billionaires list as Europe's youngest billionaire before landing on Ukraine's wanted list for alleged banking fraud. His ferrous metals business began under Kuchma, with the privatization of an iron mine in Poltava that later grew into his flagship company, Ferrexpo, which he took public in London in 2007. These were the men reshaping Ukraine's economy, and Pinchuk was right in the middle of them, using his parliamentary position and family connection to the president to position himself for the great asset grab that was coming. Then came the Gongadze murder, and everything nearly fell apart. The journalist had been running a website called Ukrainska Pravda that published damaging investigations into Kuchma's administration. On September 16, 2000, Gongadze disappeared after leaving his Kiev apartment. His wife immediately suspected foul play and began a public campaign for information. On November 2nd, the headless body was found. On November 28th, Major Mykola Melnichenko, a former security officer who had worked in Kuchma's presidential administration, released audio recordings he claimed to have made while hiding a tape recorder in the president's office. The recordings, which became known as the Melnichenko tapes, allegedly captured Kuchma and his subordinates discussing how to deal with Gongadze. On the tapes, a voice identified as Kuchma's can be heard saying things like, "I'm telling you, drive him out, throw him out, give him to the Chechens." The tapes ignited a political firestorm. Protests erupted under the banner, "Ukraine without Kuchma." International observers demanded an investigation. The scandal threatened to bring down the entire system. Kuchma denied everything, calling the allegations a horrible provocation against him. When questioned about the murder, he said he was morally ready to go through all the torments of hell so that everybody knows what I've done and what I haven't done. In 2011, Ukrainian prosecutors actually charged Kuchma with involvement in Gongadze's murder, but the case collapsed when the Constitutional Court ruled that the Melnichenko recordings had been obtained illegally and thus violated constitutional rights. The charges were dropped. Years later, after being driven from power, former Deputy Prosecutor General Renat Kuzmin told the Ihor Kolomoisky-owned television channel that Kuchma paid a colossal $1 billion bribe to close the criminal case against him, though Kuchma called this yet another dirty lie. While Kuchma fought for political survival, his son-in-law was building a media empire that would help control the narrative. Pinchuk's interests had begun spreading across the Ukrainian economy, first into banking with Credit Dnieper, then diversifying into media, where he eventually controlled 3 of Ukraine's 5 most popular television stations, STB, ICTV, and Novy Kanal. Although his oversight of these stations had long been discussed as fact, it was only formally unveiled in 2016 under new disclosure regulations, when local media confirmed his control of the Starlight Media conglomerate. This media power proved crucial during and after the Gongadze scandal. Pinchuk's television stations and his popular tabloid Fakty I Komentary could shape how millions of Ukrainians understood political events. Critical coverage could be minimized. Favorable stories could be amplified. Alternative narratives could be promoted. The media empire wasn't just profitable, it was a political weapon and a shield. And as the Kuchma administration weathered the Gongadze crisis and the massive protests it sparked, having that weapon proved invaluable. But the real money wasn't in media or even in pipes. It was in privatization. And the early 2000s saw the biggest asset grab in Ukraine's history. The crown jewels were the metallurgical plants and iron ore mining operations that had been built during the Soviet era. These were massive industrial complexes, employing tens of thousands of workers and controlling billions of dollars in assets. Under Soviet central planning, they had been state property. Now, they were being sold off, theoretically through competitive auctions, but in practice, through rigged processes that favored those with political connections. The scheme that would later be exposed in London's High Court was breathtaking in its scale and brazenness. In 2004, 9 mining and steel plants were spun off from the state holding company Ukrudprom and privatized. According to court documents and parliamentary investigations, 3 Ukrainian oligarchs had allegedly divided up the assets beforehand. Rinat Akhmetov would get 5 plants, Ihor Kolomoisky and Gennady Bogolyubov would get 3, and Viktor Pinchuk would get 1. Pinchuk's role was reportedly to mobilize political forces in parliament, including his own party, to secure passage of the legislation enabling the privatization, and to ensure his father-in-law, President Kuchma, signed it into law. The prices were absurdly low. Parliamentarian Pavlo Ryzanenko, who headed a special investigation into the Ukhrudprom privatization a decade later, told the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project that Ukraine lost billions in the deal. If we look at the real value of the assets of the holding company Ukhrudprom in 2005, it amounted to about $20 billion. And this entire holding was purchased for as little as $400 million due to artificially limited competition, he said. That's a 98% discount on one of Ukraine's most valuable industrial assets, sold to three men who happened to have the right political connections. But the Ukhrudprom deal would come back to haunt Pinchuk in ways he couldn't have predicted. According to allegations he later made in London's High Court, Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov had allegedly agreed to purchase one of the plants, the Kryvyi Rih iron ore facility, on his behalf. Pinchuk claimed he reached an oral agreement with them in July 2004, 1 month before the facility was privatized, whereby they would buy it and transfer the shares to his company at a later date. He alleged the agreement was made in the presence of 3 witnesses, including Ukraine's richest man, Rinat Akhmetov. Pinchuk claimed he deposited funds for the purchase and that the money was withdrawn, but the shares were never transferred as supposedly promised. Instead, according to his version of events, when the time came to hand over the promised factory, Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov tricked him into buying a worthless offshore firm called Across for $143 million. The company, he alleged, held no assets in reality, and the factory remained with Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov, neither of whom spent much time in Ukraine. Kolomoisky lived in Geneva, while Bogolyubov lived in London, as did Pinchuk, who had established his East One holding company headquarters there. Meanwhile, other privatizations were proceeding with similar irregularities. In 2004, Pinchuk and Rinat Akhmetov, 2 of Ukraine's richest men, acquired the Kryvyi steel factory for approximately $800 million through what was supposed to be a competitive auction. However, even this carefully orchestrated sale would be challenged when the Orange Revolution swept Ukraine later that year, bringing reformers to power who promised to investigate corrupt privatizations. In January 2006, Ukraine's Supreme Court dropped a bombshell. It ruled that the part privatization of the Nikopol steel factory to Interpipe in 2003 was illegal. The decision was a direct challenge to Pinchuk's empire, suggesting that at least some of his asset acquisitions during the Kuchma years had violated Ukrainian law. However, in a move that perfectly illustrated the limits of Ukraine's legal system when confronting oligarchic power, the ruling did not affect other purchases of smaller stakes in the company. Pinchuk kept the assets. The Supreme Court had declared his acquisition illegal, but he faced no criminal charges, paid no fines, and maintained control of the industrial complex he had acquired. The Orange Revolution of 2004 had been fueled largely by widespread disgust among Ukrainians with exactly this kind of corruption. Protests erupted after President Kuchma's chosen successor, Viktor Yanukovych, appeared to have won a presidential election marred by massive fraud. The protests forced a Supreme Court ruling and a rerun election, which Viktor Yushchenko won. Newly elected leaders, Yushchenko and Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, came to power with strong anti-oligarch rhetoric. Tymoshenko, Pinchuk's former business partner from the energy trading days, went after assets she claimed were unfairly privatized, explicitly targeting those connected to the Kuchma family. For Pinchuk, the Orange Revolution was more than a political headache. His father-in-law had been driven from power. His political party had lost influence. His business empire, built on connections to Kuchma's administration, suddenly seemed vulnerable to prosecution or reprivatization. Like other oligarchs who had thrived under Kuchma, he had supported Yanukovych in the disputed election, betting that the system would hold. When it didn't, he needed a new strategy. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. He would take his businesses abroad, restructuring them into a UK-registered holding company called East One, as part of a wave of offshorizations that followed the Orange Revolution. By moving his corporate structures to London, he placed them beyond the easy reach of Ukrainian prosecutors or reprivatization efforts. British courts would now have jurisdiction over many disputes involving his companies. His assets were ring-fenced, protected by the British legal system and the complexity of international corporate law. And then he waited. Within a few years, the revolutionaries' anti-corruption zeal flagged exactly as he had predicted. Internal feuding between Yushchenko and Timoshenko paralyzed the government. Reform efforts stalled. Public disillusionment grew. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, the same man whose fraudulent election had sparked the Orange Revolution, won the presidency in a vote international observers deemed mostly fair. The business climate returned to what it had been before, and oligarchs like Pinchuk found themselves back in favor. But the Supreme Court ruling on the Nikopol factory, even if it hadn't resulted in serious consequences, was a warning. It showed that Ukraine's legal system could, under certain political conditions, challenge oligarchic acquisitions. The solution was to ensure those political conditions never arose again. And that required controlling not just factories and banks, but information itself. By the time Pinchuk's media empire was fully operational, controlling 3 major television channels and a popular tabloid, Ukraine's oligarchs had perfected a system of mutual blackmail and information warfare. Each oligarch owned media outlets that could be weaponized against rivals. Compromising materials, known in Russian as kompromat, circulated constantly. Television channels didn't just report news, they manufactured political reality. And when oligarchs went to war with each other, their media holdings became the first line of attack, flooding airwaves with allegations, leaked documents, and carefully edited footage designed to destroy reputations and pressure authorities into action. This media warfare reached its peak with the rise of the Teletriumph Awards, Ukraine's main television industry honors. As a result of vast holdings by oligarchs like Pinchuk and Ihor Kolomoisky in Ukrainian television, their companies dominated the awards, leading to tensions within the industry. Boycotts became common, both by companies opposing Pinchuk and by companies owned by Pinchuk and his wife, turning what should have been an industry celebration into another battlefield for oligarchic competition. The awards weren't about recognizing quality programming. They were about demonstrating power and humiliating rivals. But controlling information could only protect Pinchuk so far. On March 18, 2015, Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, one of the new investigative agencies established under Western pressure after the Maidan uprising, opened criminal proceedings that sent shockwaves through the oligarchic class. According to the investigation, Viktor Pinchuk had allegedly received $110 million in bribes between 2003 and 2006. The time frame was significant. These were the golden years of his father-in-law's presidency, the period when Pinchuk had been acquiring steel factories and building his empire. The investigation suggested that his wealth wasn't just the result of clever business moves, but of systematic corruption at the highest levels of government. The bribery allegations became even more specific and damaging when fellow oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky decided to go public with accusations. On March 4, 2015, at a hearing of the Special Control Commission on Privatization in Ukraine's parliament, Kolomoisky made an explosive claim. Viktor Pinchuk had been receiving $5 million per month in bribes for the rights to manage Ukrinafta, a company 50% owned by the state-controlled Naftogaz of Ukraine. "We paid this money, and besides that, we paid dividends to the state, all taxes and everything else," Kolomoisky told the assembled parliamentarians. "But for the right to receive our dividends, we were forced to pay another $5 million from our dividends to Pinchuk." Kolomoisky's testimony suggested a staggering level of corruption. If his claims were accurate, Pinchuk had been extracting $60 million per year just from this one arrangement, using his political connections to insert himself as a middleman who had to be paid for access to what should have been a straightforward business relationship. The allegation painted a picture of Ukraine's economy as a protection racket writ large, where those with presidential connections could demand tribute from anyone who wanted to do business with state-owned enterprises. Yet, despite the National Anti-Corruption Bureau's investigation and Kolomoisky's public testimony before Parliament, no charges were ever filed against Pinchuk. The investigation simply faded away, disappearing into the same bureaucratic void that had swallowed so many cases against Ukraine's oligarchs. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout Ukrainian history. Dramatic announcements of investigations, media coverage, public outrage, and then nothing. The system protected its own, and Pinchuk remained untouchable. But Kolomoisky's decision to testify against Pinchuk wasn't motivated by civic duty or anti-corruption zeal. It was revenge. The two oligarchs had been locked in an increasingly bitter dispute that would eventually explode into one of the most expensive and sensational court cases in British legal history. The conflict centered on that Kryvyi Rih iron ore facility that Pinchuk claimed Kolomoisky and his partner Gennady Bogolyubov had promised to purchase on his behalf back in 2004. After years of fighting through media proxies and political channels, Pinchuk decided to take the battle to London's High Court. In December 2015, Pinchuk brought a $2 billion civil action against Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov in the High Court of Justice in London over the 2004 purchase of the Ukrainian mining company. The lawsuit was breathtaking in its scope and the allegations it contained. Court documents revealed claims of murder, beatings, bribery, and corporate fraud on a scale that shocked even observers familiar with Ukrainian business practices. Both sides accused each other of using violence to advance business interests, of corrupting government officials, and of building their fortunes through criminal means. The case exposed the methods by which Ukraine's oligarchs had operated during the Wild West period of the early 2000s. Pinchuk alleged that he had reached an agreement with Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov to acquire the mining facility, deposited funds for its purchase, but then been tricked into buying a worthless shell company instead, while his supposed partners kept the valuable assets. He claimed this constituted fraud on a massive scale, seeking $2 billion in damages. Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov fired back with their own allegations. They suggested Pinchuk had used his position as the president's son-in-law to rig privatizations and extract bribes. They disputed his version of events regarding the mining company purchase. And they leveled their own accusations of corruption and illegal business practices. The case had everything: allegations of violence, suggestions of political manipulation, claims of billion-dollar frauds, and the promise that Ukrainian oligarchs would be forced to testify under oath in a British courtroom about how they really built their empires. Legal experts called it one of the most expensive cases in British history. Lawyers on both sides were billing millions in fees. Discovery was producing thousands of documents revealing the inner workings of Ukrainian oligarchic business practices. The trial promised to be a spectacle that would expose decades of corruption, violence, and illegal dealing at the highest levels of Ukrainian society. British judges would finally have the opportunity to examine exactly how post-Soviet oligarchs had amassed their fortunes. And then, suddenly, it all disappeared. In January 2016, just days before the trial was scheduled to begin, the parties announced they had reached an out-of-court settlement. The terms were confidential. No one would testify. No documents would be made public. The British courts would render no judgment on the allegations. After months of dramatic legal filings and media coverage, the case simply evaporated, leaving only questions about what the oligarchs had wanted to keep hidden badly enough to settle a $2 billion lawsuit at the last possible moment. For years, the details of that settlement remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in Ukrainian business circles. Pinchuk's press secretary cited confidentiality obligations when asked about it. Kolomoisky declined to comment. Bogolyubov didn't respond to requests for information. It seemed the public would never know how one of the biggest legal battles between post-Soviet oligarchs had been resolved. But then came the Paradise Papers. In 2017, A massive leak of documents from two offshore services firms based in Bermuda and Singapore, along with 19 corporate registries maintained by governments in secret offshore jurisdictions, revealed what had really happened. The documents were obtained by Germany's Süddeutsche Zeitung and shared with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which organized a collaborative investigation with dozens of outlets across the world, including the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project and Ukraine's Slidstvo.info. The Paradise Papers revealed that on January 20, 2016, 5 days before the trial was set to begin, Pinchuk's lawyers from the London-based Hogan Lovells had approached Appleby, a global offshore law firm, to establish 2 Isle of Man companies. These weren't just any companies. They were specifically designed to receive and hold valuable London real estate as part of the settlement. On February 16, 2016, Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov transferred 2 upscale London properties to Pinchuk's newly created offshore entities, the Grand Building at Trafalgar Square and Standard House on Northumberland Avenue. These weren't minor properties. They were prime commercial real estate in central London, worth tens of millions of pounds. The Grand Building sits at one of London's most famous landmarks, Trafalgar Square, a location that commands premium rents and represents a trophy asset. Standard House on Northumberland Avenue is similarly prestigious. Together, they represented a settlement worth far more than any monetary judgment might have produced, and they came with the additional benefit of being held through offshore structures that provided privacy and potential tax advantages. The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project's investigation into the Paradise Papers revealed that the offshore structure had been assembled in a manner that appeared designed to avoid Ukrainian taxes. By routing the settlement through Isle of Man companies rather than directly transferring the properties to Pinchuk or his Ukrainian entities, the transaction occurred outside Ukrainian jurisdiction and tax authorities' immediate oversight. It was a masterclass in how oligarchs use offshore financial centers to settle disputes and move assets while minimizing both publicity and tax liability. But the Paradise Papers also revealed something else. The settlement wasn't just about business. Both oligarchs wanted to avoid testifying under oath in a British courtroom. A trial would have required them to produce documents, answer questions about their business practices during the privatization era, and potentially expose themselves to further legal jeopardy. The allegations in the case included serious crimes. If either side had testified to knowledge of murders, beatings, or major bribery schemes under oath, that testimony could have been used by prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. By settling, both sides avoided that risk. Pinchuk got valuable London real estate. Kolomoisky and Bogolyubov avoided a trial that might have led to criminal charges. The British legal system was denied the opportunity to examine how post-Soviet fortunes were really built. And the Ukrainian public was denied transparency about how their country's industrial assets had been divided among oligarchs in the 2000s. Everyone won, except the rule of law. The settlement also illustrated something crucial about the post-Soviet oligarchic class. Despite their bitter rivalries and media wars, they shared a common interest in keeping certain secrets buried. They would fight viciously over assets, use media empires to destroy each other's reputations, and even make allegations of violence and murder. But when push came to shove, when a real legal reckoning threatened that might expose the entire system, they would unite to protect themselves and settle their disputes in offshore secrecy. Yet even as Pinchuk was settling his lawsuit with Kolomoisky, he was cultivating a very different image in the West. While Ukrainian prosecutors and parliamentary investigations documented allegations of corruption and bribery, Pinchuk was positioning himself as a philanthropist, a pro-Western reformer, and a champion of Ukraine's European integration. The vehicle for this transformation was his foundation and a network of strategic donations to Western institutions and political figures. In 2004, Pinchuk had created the Yalta European Strategy, an international organization designed to promote Ukraine joining the European Union. Its annual summer meeting in Yalta had been a Ukraine-EU forum for debate and policy recommendations, bringing together Western politicians, business leaders, and intellectuals with their Ukrainian counterparts. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the meetings moved to Kyiv, but continued to attract high-profile speakers and participants. But Pinchuk's real genius was understanding that in the West, money could buy not just assets, but reputation. He began donating heavily to think tanks and policy institutions that shaped how Western elites understood Ukraine and post-Soviet politics. He became a member of the board of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, of the International Advisory Council of the Brookings Institution, and of the Corporate Advisory Board of the Global Business Coalition Against HIV/AIDS, TB, and Malaria. These weren't just charitable activities. They were investments in influence and legitimacy. The donations gave Pinchuk access to networks of policymakers, journalists, and academics. When Western media outlets needed expert commentary on Ukraine, they would often turn to scholars at institutions Pinchuk supported. When Western politicians wanted to understand Ukrainian politics, they might attend conferences his foundation sponsored. The funding created subtle but real pressure to view Pinchuk favorably, or at least to avoid examining too closely the origins of his wealth. After all, he was a donor, a supporter of European integration, a man who brought together East and West for productive dialogue. But Pinchuk's most controversial act of reputation laundering involved his secret funding of a report that would become central to one of the biggest political scandals in American politics. In 2012, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych, who had returned to power in 2010, was facing international criticism for the imprisonment of his political rival, former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. Yanukovych's government had prosecuted Tymoshenko on what many international observers considered politically motivated charges, sentencing her to 7 years in prison for abuse of office. To counter this criticism, Yanukovych's government commissioned an independent legal review of Tymoshenko's trial and conviction. The review was to be conducted by Skadden, Arps, Slate, Mauger, and Flom, one of America's most prestigious law firms. The partner leading the work was Gregory Craig, who had served as White House counsel for President Barack Obama and was a close associate of Bill and Hillary Clinton. Craig's involvement would give the report credibility and the appearance of genuine independence from the Ukrainian government. But there was a problem. Someone had to pay Skadden's fees, which would exceed $4 million. If Yanukovych's government paid directly, the report would obviously be compromised. The solution was elegant and corrupt. Viktor Pinchuk would secretly fund the report through offshore accounts, while the work was publicly presented as independent legal analysis. The scheme was brought to Craig by Doug Schoen, an American pollster who had worked for Bill Clinton and was on Pinchuk's payroll at $40,000 per month. Skadden's final report, released in 2012, essentially validated Yanukovych's prosecution of Tymoshenko. While noting some procedural concerns, it concluded that her trial had been generally fair and that her conviction was legally supported. The report gave Yanukovych exactly what he wanted: an independent assessment from a prestigious American law firm that he could use to deflect Western criticism. It was used by his government and his defenders to argue that Tymoshenko was a criminal, not a political prisoner. What wasn't disclosed at the time was who had really paid for it. According to testimony and documents that would later emerge, Pinchuk had funded most of the $4.6 million fee through a series of offshore transactions designed to hide his role. Internal emails between Craig and Paul Manafort, who was working as an advisor to Yanukovych, discussed how Pinchuk, referred to in the emails as Business Person 1, wanted his role in funding the report kept anonymous. Skadden filings with the Foreign Agents Registration Act database later revealed that the firm understood that its work was to be largely funded by Viktor Pinchuk. When this scheme was eventually exposed, Pinchuk issued a statement denying any financial involvement. Mr. Pinchuk was not the source of any funds used to pay fees of Skadden in producing their report into the trial and conviction of Yulia Tymoshenko. He was in no way responsible for those costs. Neither Mr. Pinchuk nor companies affiliated with him have ever been a client of Skadden. Mr. Pinchuk and his team had no role in the work done by Skadden, including in the preparation or dissemination of the Skadden report. But on April 15, 2019, Gregory Craig himself contradicted that denial. In a video statement released as he faced federal indictment for lying about his work on the Ukraine report, Craig publicly stated, "It was Doug Schoen who brought this project to me, and he told me he was acting on behalf of Mr. Viktor Pinchuk, who is a pro-Western Ukrainian businessman who helped fund the project." Craig was ultimately indicted for lying about aspects of his work on the report, including the nature and extent of his communications with the media, in order to avoid registering as a foreign agent. The indictment alleged that Craig had misled the Justice Department about whether his work constituted lobbying for a foreign government. He adamantly denied the allegations, explaining that he had worked with other attorneys to determine whether registration was required and concluded it was not. But the damage was done. One of America's most prominent lawyers had been criminally charged in connection with work secretly funded by a Ukrainian oligarch to whitewash an autocrat's show trial. The Skadden report scandal revealed the lengths to which Pinchuk would go to curry favor with whoever held power in Ukraine. Despite his public image as a pro-Western reformer, he had secretly funded a report defending Viktor Yanukovych, the same president who would violently crack down on pro-European protesters in 2013 to 2014, triggering the Maidan Revolution. Pinchuk's real loyalty wasn't to democracy or European integration. It was to maintaining his access to power and protecting his business empire regardless of who was in charge. Meanwhile, Pinchuk was also facing challenges to his business operations from an unexpected direction: American steel manufacturers. In 2013, U.S. steelmakers filed a case with the United States Department of Commerce alleging that Interpipe Group was illegally dumping steel tubes into the American natural gas market. The accusation was that Pinchuk's company was selling pipes in the United States at prices below the cost of production, effectively using predatory pricing to drive American competitors out of business and capture market share. Dumping cases are complex, involving detailed financial analysis and international trade law. But the basic allegation was serious. Interpipe was violating international trade rules to gain an unfair advantage. In November 2013, Fitch Ratings downgraded Interpipe's credit rating because of the dumping accusations, combined with a missed $106 million debt payment. The downgrade signaled that international financial institutions were taking the allegations seriously and were concerned about Interpipe's financial stability and business practices. The dumping case threatened not just Interpipe's access to the lucrative American market, but also Pinchuk's broader reputation as a legitimate international businessman. If Interpipe were found to be dumping, it would face punitive tariffs that could effectively exclude its products from the United States. The case dragged on for years, with lawyers on both sides arguing over production costs, pricing strategies, and whether Interpipe's behavior constituted illegal dumping or legitimate competitive pricing. Yet even as he fought dumping allegations in America and corruption investigations in Ukraine, Pinchuk maintained the lifestyle of a billionaire who had nothing to worry about. In a display of wealth that shocked even those familiar with oligarchic excess, Pinchuk spent more than $6 million on his 50th birthday party in Courchevel, the French ski resort favored by the global ultra-wealthy. He flew in Cirque du Soleil performers to entertain his guests and hired celebrity chef Alain Ducasse to prepare the meals. The party was everything one would expect from a man who had amassed billions from Ukraine's industrial assets: ostentatious, expensive, and utterly disconnected from the reality of life for ordinary Ukrainians. While Pinchuk and his guests watched acrobatic performances in a luxury mountain resort, average Ukrainians were earning monthly wages often under $300. The wealth gap between oligarchs and ordinary citizens had grown so extreme that they essentially lived in different countries, separated not just by economics, but by entire universes of experience and expectation. Pinchuk and his wife Olena, who runs an AIDS foundation in Ukraine, had become fixtures in international high society. They were friends with Elton John and Bill Clinton, whose 65th birthday party they attended in Los Angeles. They collected contemporary art on a massive scale, with Pinchuk known to own large sculptures by Jeff Koons, Damien Hirst, and other market darlings. His fortune was estimated at $1.44 billion by Forbes in 2016, and he appeared on the Art News Top 200 Collectors list every year from 2008 onwards, and on the Art Review Power 100 list every year from 2008 to 2014. In 2010, Pinchuk had attended the Time 100 Gala, an event celebrating the most influential people in the world. He operated the Pinchuk Art Center in Kyiv, which organized Ukraine's pavilion at the 2015 Venice Biennale, and administered the Future Generation Art Prize, which came with a $100,000 purse for emerging artists. These weren't just vanity projects. They were carefully calibrated to position Pinchuk as a sophisticated cultural patron, rather than an oligarch who had built his fortune through privatizations that Ukrainian courts had deemed illegal. The contrast between his public persona and the allegations against him was stark. In the West, he was Viktor Pinchuk, the philanthropist, the art collector, the supporter of Ukrainian democracy and European integration. In Ukraine, he was an oligarch who controlled media empires, faced bribery investigations, and settled billion-dollar lawsuits through secret offshore deals. Both versions were real, and both served his interests. The question was which version Western institutions would choose to see when they accepted his donations and attended his conferences. In February 2019, Michael Cohen, Trump's former personal attorney and fixer, testified under oath before the House Oversight Committee about the Pinchuk payment. Cohen's testimony was devastating in its specificity. He stated that Trump had personally directed him to structure the payment as a donation to the Trump Foundation, rather than as a personal speaking fee. "I was directed by Mr. Trump to have the contract done in the name of the Donald J. Trump Foundation, as opposed to Donald J. Trump personally," Cohen told the assembled members of Congress. This wasn't an unusual practice for Trump, who had a long history of using his charitable foundation as a personal slush fund. But Cohen's testimony, delivered under oath and under penalty of perjury, established that Trump had knowingly directed foreign money into his foundation during his presidential campaign. The Trump Foundation would later be dissolved as part of an investigation by New York's Attorney General into its operations, with the investigation revealing that Trump had used foundation funds to pay for a 6-foot-tall portrait of himself, among other personal expenses. Special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election expanded to include the Pinchuk donation. Prosecutors subpoenaed the Trump Foundation, seeking documents related to the payment. The interest in Pinchuk's donation suggested Mueller's team was examining whether foreign nationals had used charitable contributions to influence American political figures or to gain leverage during the campaign. Marcus Owens, former head of the IRS division overseeing tax-exempt foundations, told the New York Times that the payment is curious because it comes during a campaign and is from a foreigner and looks like an effort to buy influence. The Trump campaign's response to questions about the donation was telling. A statement from the Viktor Pinchuk Foundation emphasized that the honorarium was a specific request of Mr. Trump Foundation in September of 2015, when there were multiple candidates for the Republican nomination for president, and it was by no means assured that Mr. Trump would be the Republican nominee in 2016. The statement seemed designed to suggest the payment wasn't intended to influence a future president, since Trump's nomination wasn't certain at the time. But September 2015 was 3 months into Trump's campaign, and he was already leading in most Republican primary polls. What made the twin donations to Clinton and Trump particularly significant was what they revealed about oligarchic strategy. Pinchuk wasn't ideologically committed to either American political party. He was hedging his bets, ensuring that regardless of who won the 2016 election, he would have some relationship with the victor. This wasn't unusual behavior for an oligarch. Maintaining relationships with multiple political factions was standard practice in Ukrainian politics, where fortunes could shift rapidly. But applying that strategy to American politics revealed a level of sophistication and cynicism that disturbed even those familiar with big-money political influence. For Western institutions that had accepted Pinchuk's money, the revelations were embarrassing. The Brookings Institution and the Atlantic Council, two of Washington's most prestigious think tanks, had both received significant Pinchuk donations. The Peterson Institute for International Economics had made him a board member. These institutions prided themselves on their independence and analytical rigor. Learning that a major donor was simultaneously giving to both Clinton and Trump foundations while facing corruption investigations in Ukraine raised uncomfortable questions about whether Pinchuk's donations had influenced their Ukraine coverage or their willingness to examine his background. The think tank donations were particularly important because they shaped how elite American opinion understood Ukraine and its oligarchs. When Brookings or Atlantic Council scholars appeared on television or testified before Congress about Ukraine policy, their institutional affiliations lent them credibility. But if those institutions were funded by Ukrainian oligarchs, were their scholars really independent analysts or unwitting participants in reputation laundering schemes? The question wasn't whether individual scholars were corrupt. Most were certainly sincere in their views, but whether institutional dependencies created subtle pressures to avoid examining certain topics too closely. Yet even as Pinchuk was buying influence in Washington, his position in Ukraine was becoming increasingly complicated. In 2016, he published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "Ukraine Must Make Painful Compromises for Peace with Russia," in which he suggested Ukraine should temporarily abandon the prospect of EU membership, exclude NATO membership, and make compromises with Russia on the Crimea Peninsula to achieve peace in eastern Ukraine. The article drew immediate and fierce criticism from Ukrainian political authorities. Then-President Petro Poroshenko was so angered by Pinchuk's suggestions that he canceled a planned visit to the Davos Ukrainian Lunch, Pinchuk's signature annual event at the World Economic Forum, which was scheduled for January 19, 2017. Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadze, who served as Vice Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine, stated publicly that the theses of Pinchuk's peace plan had already been used by Russian propaganda. For a man who had spent years positioning himself as pro-Western and pro-European, the article was a spectacular own goal, confirming suspicions that his real interest was maintaining business relationships rather than supporting Ukrainian sovereignty. The timing was significant. In summer 2013, Russia had imposed sanctions on Ukrainian imports from companies of three businessmen deemed pro-European: Viktor Pinchuk's Interpipe, Serhei Taruta's Industrial Union of Donbass, and Petro Poroshenko's Roshan. These sanctions are now widely regarded as the first public steps on the road toward the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The sanctions hurt Pinchuk's business badly. Russia was a crucial market for Interpipe's pipes and railway wheels. Then, on November 1, 2018, Russia dramatically expanded its sanctions, placing Viktor Pinchuk personally and his companies on a comprehensive list targeting 322 Ukrainian individuals and 68 legal entities. The sanctions involved freezing non-cash funds, uncertified securities, and property in Russian territory, plus a ban on transferring funds abroad from Russia. The list included Pinchuk's East One holding company, Bank Credit Dnieper, and his Starlight Media Group. Curiously, Interpipe itself didn't initially face sanctions, suggesting Russia wanted to maintain some business relationship while punishing Pinchuk politically. By April 2019, Russia had imposed a total embargo on Ukrainian pipes, and by February 2021 on railroad manufacturing. Pinchuk's spokesperson confirmed, as of November 1, 2018, Viktor Pinchuk, the individual, and his companies are on Russia's sanctions list. Since April 2019, Russia has had a total embargo on Ukrainian pipes, and since February 2021 on railroad manufacturing. The sanctions seemed to position Pinchuk exactly as he wanted to be seen in the West, a pro-European businessman being punished by Putin's regime for his democratic values. But then came Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and with it came investigations that revealed a far more complicated picture. In July 2019, Radio Free Europe/Radio Liberty published an investigation showing that in the first 5 months of 2019, after Russian sanctions had supposedly cut off business, Interpipe had exported more than 1 billion Ukrainian hryvnia, approximately $40 million, to Russia. The investigation documented that despite ongoing hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, despite Russian sanctions on Pinchuk and his businesses, and despite his public positioning as a victim of Russian aggression, his company was still doing significant business with the enemy. The RFE/RL investigation revealed that Interpipe maintained a trading subsidiary in Russia called LLC Interpipe M. Despite claims that the company was being liquidated following the 2022 invasion, corporate records showed it remained operational. In February 2023, a new director was appointed to LLC Interpipe M, which would have required a general meeting of participants and approval from the ultimate beneficial owner, Viktor Pinchuk. The appointment of a new director wasn't consistent with a company in liquidation. It suggested continued operations. In August 2023, the Ukrainian news outlet UA Position published a detailed investigation into Interpipe's Russian operations. The investigation exposed that through a chain of registered companies, Pinchuk maintained ownership and control of Interpipe M. When confronted with the evidence, Interpipe issued a statement categorically denying false accusations and claiming the company had made the decision to liquidate its trading company in Russia after the full-scale invasion. The statement claimed only 2 employees remained, involved in liquidation procedures. But UA Position's analysis of the company's denials revealed they didn't actually refute the specific facts presented. The company claimed it had decided to liquidate, but provided no evidence the liquidation had been completed. It claimed personnel had been dismissed, except 2 individuals, but corporate records showed a new director appointed in February 2023, suggesting ongoing management rather than wind-down operations. Most damningly, the company provided no specific response to documentation showing continued contributions to the Russian budget through taxes and fees. The contradiction was stark. Pinchuk was publicly positioning himself as a Ukrainian patriot, using his foundation to host events about Russian war crimes and calling Putin a war criminal, while his company appeared to maintain operations in Russia that generated tax revenue for the Russian government. In March 2022, Pinchuk's press service had responded to questions about supporting Ukraine's army by stating, "Yes, through their foundations and companies, and in close cooperation with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and volunteer organizations, Viktor and Olena Pinchuk are searching abroad for the purchase and supply of personal protective equipment for the military and territorial defense forces." The statement continued, "This includes medical supplies and materials for severe injuries, including resuscitation backpacks and more. The work continues 24/7. In addition, their industrial companies are working to support military units and territorial defense divisions." It was a carefully crafted message designed to show Pinchuk as fully committed to Ukraine's defense. But if his companies were simultaneously contributing to Russian tax revenues, the patriotic narrative collapsed into something far more cynical. An oligarch positioning himself for whatever political outcome might emerge while ensuring his business interests remained protected. By 2025, Pinchuk's spokesperson confirmed he was frequently traveling in and out of Ukraine for both business and personal reasons. She emphasized, For us, Ukraine is our only homeland, the only thing that matters to us. This is the place in which we invest, the place for which we will fight together. In February 2022, just before the full-scale invasion, the spokesperson said Pinchuk was in Dnipro, followed by Kyiv, then flying to Germany for the Munich Security Conference. The pattern suggested a man splitting his time between Ukraine, where his industrial operations were based, and Western Europe, where his wealth was protected in offshore structures and London real estate. Forbes magazine's July 2025 ranking placed Pinchuk as the 1,141st wealthiest person in the world, with a fortune of $3.3 billion. He continued operating the Pinchuk Art Center in Kyiv, which in September 2025 opened an exhibition for the Pinchuk Art Center Prize, featuring works by 20 shortlisted Ukrainian artists. The main prize offered 400,000 hryvnia, with 2 special prizes of 100,000 hryvnia each, plus financial support for internships and education. The winner would automatically be included in the shortlist for the Future Generation Art Prize 2026, Pinchuk's International Art Prize for Young Artists. His foundation continued hosting the annual Ukrainian breakfast at Davos, Switzerland, during the World Economic Forum. In January 2023, the foundation held a discussion titled Holding Russia Accountable: Roadmap for Reparations in Ukraine, in Davos, featuring Ukrainian officials and international experts discussing war crimes prosecution and mechanisms for extracting reparations from Russia. The event was part of the Ukraine is You project, organized by Pinchuk's foundation in cooperation with the Office of the President of Ukraine. Pinchuk had even rented Building 68 on Davos's promenade and rebranded it as Russia's War Crimes House, formerly Russia House, where he presented information about Ukrainian civilian war deaths. It was sophisticated reputation management, positioning himself at the center of international efforts to hold Russia accountable, while questions lingered about his own company's Russian business relationships. The contrast between the public-facing Davos activism and the investigative journalism documenting Interpipe's Russian operations illustrated the 2 tracks on which Pinchuk operated. His East One holding company remained headquartered in London, providing both a prestigious business address and the protections of British corporate law. London had become the preferred destination for post-Soviet wealth, with its combination of rule of law protections, sophisticated financial services, and limited scrutiny of the origins of foreign money. Pinchuk's offshore structures, revealed in the Paradise Papers, allowed him to hold assets through Isle of Man companies, while maintaining operational control. The Grand Building at Trafalgar Square and Standard House on Northumberland Avenue, the properties he'd received from Kolomoisky in their secret settlement, represented not just real estate, but trophies of his ability to navigate the British legal and financial system. The question of where Pinchuk's ultimate loyalties lay remained unresolved. Was he a genuine Ukrainian patriot whose business had been caught in the impossible situation of trying to maintain pre-war relationships during wartime? Or was he an oligarch whose nationalism extended exactly as far as his business interests, willing to support Ukraine when it was profitable and convenient, but maintaining Russian relationships when they served his bottom line? The evidence suggested the latter, but Pinchuk's sophisticated Western public relations operation successfully maintained enough ambiguity to prevent definitive judgment. His relationship with Monica Crowley, a former Trump aide who registered as a foreign agent for Pinchuk in March 2017, illustrated his continued cultivation of American political connections across party lines. Even after Trump's election, even after the controversy over his foundation donation, Pinchuk maintained channels to the Republican administration. The registration under the Foreign Agents Registration Act showed Crowley was working to advance Pinchuk's interests in Washington, though the specific nature of that work remained unclear. What was clear was that Pinchuk had successfully executed a strategy that few other post-Soviet oligarchs had managed, remaining relevant and influential across multiple regime changes, multiple investigations, and multiple scandals. He had survived the Gongadze murder scandal that destroyed his father-in-law's reputation. He had weathered the Orange Revolution that targeted oligarchic corruption. He had maintained his position through Yanukovych's return and the Maidan uprising that followed. He had navigated Russian sanctions and Ukrainian anti-corruption investigations. He had managed relationships with both Clinton and Trump, and he had positioned himself as a wartime patriot while evidence suggested continued business with Russia.